The pipe above the workbench groaned, a low, structural complaint that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then came the smell, wet plaster and old dust. I scrambled, throwing a plastic tarp over the 17th century celestial atlas just as the ceiling wept its first dirty tear. This book was the only thing standing between me and bankruptcy. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then, the shop door chime cut through the panic. I spun around. A woman stood silhouetted against the gray rain, perfectly tailored, bone dry, and so terrifyingly calm. My studio usually felt like a sanctuary. It was a chaotic nest of leather scraps, pots of wheat paste, and the heavy, sweet scent of decaying paper. It was where I hid from the world, where I fixed things that were falling apart because I couldn't fix my own life. But as this woman stepped inside, the air shifted. She cut through the atmosphere like a cold front. She carried a leather briefcase that cost more than my car, and her gaze swept over my cluttered benches with the precision of a scalpel.
"Kristen Vance?" she asked.
Her voice was low, smooth, and lacked any trace of the humidity that was currently curling the edges of my accounting paperwork. "We're closed," I said, wiping my glue-stained hands on my apron. "And I have a plumbing emergency." "I'm not a customer," she replied, closing the door behind her. The sound of the rain vanished, replaced by a silence that felt heavy, coiled. "I'm Luna Sterling. The estate sent me." The name hit me harder than the water dripping into the bucket behind me. Sterling. The archivist they'd threatened to send. The one who decided if my contract was worth keeping, or if they'd seize the assets and leave me with nothing. She was the executioner, and she looked the part. She moved further into the room, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm on the hardwood. She stopped at the edge of my main workbench, close enough that I could smell her. Not rain, but something expensive and grounding, like sandalwood and old libraries. "The atlas," she said, her eyes locking onto the tarp. "I'm here to take it." "You can't," I snapped, stepping between her and the book. My protective instinct flared, hot and immediate. "It's in critical condition. The binding is shot, the spine is dissolving. You move it now, you destroy it." Luna looked at me, really looked at me. Her eyes were a dark, intelligent brown, unflinching. She wasn't looking at the mess anymore. She was assessing the panic in my posture, the tremor in my hands that I tried to hide by gripping the edge of the table. She took a step closer, invading my personal space with an authority that made my breath hitch. She wasn't aggressive, but she was undeniable. "If I leave it here," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "it stays in a room with a leaking ceiling and a conservator who looks like she hasn't slept in 3 days." "I know this book," I countered, though my voice lacked her cool stability. "I know its wounds. You take it out into that storm, and it's gone." She paused, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. The tension in the room thickened, charged with something that wasn't just professional rivalry. She reached past me, her arm brushing against my shoulder, the heat of her skin searing through my thin cotton shirt. She peeled back the corner of the tarp, inspecting the exposed vellum with a critical eye. I held my breath, waiting for the condemnation. Instead, she sighed, a sound of frustration and concession. She set her briefcase on the only clear spot of the counter. The metal clasps snapped open, loud in the quiet room. "Fine," she said, without looking up. "It stays." Relief washed over me, raw and immediate. But she cut it short. "But so do I," she added, pulling out a pair of white cotton gloves. "If you think I'm leaving a priceless artifact in a compromised facility, you're mistaken. We secure the environment, and we start the assessment now." "Now?" I asked. "It's 6 p.m. Then we have a long night ahead of us." She looked up, and for the first time, I saw a spark of challenge in her eyes. "Unless you're not up for it." The challenge hung there, vibrating in the space between us. I looked at the leak, at the book, and then at this woman who had just commandeered my sanctuary. I had no choice. "I'll get the coffee," I said quietly. The silence in the studio had changed. It wasn't the peaceful, dusty quiet of my usual late nights anymore. It was the tense, pressurized silence of an operating theater. Luna moved with a ruthless economy of motion. She didn't just walk, she navigated. She didn't just touch, she examined. The snap of her latex gloves as she pulled them on was sharp, a violent punctuation mark ending my autonomy in my own space. She produced a magnifying loupe from her pocket, a heavy brass thing that looked antique but probably cost a fortune, and bent over the atlas. I watched her. I couldn't help it. She was dissecting my work before I'd even begun. "The humidity in here is fluctuating," she noted, not looking up. She ran a gloved finger along the spine, hovering just millimeters above the leather. 60%, maybe 62. That's lethal for 17th century vellum, Kristen. "It's raining," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "And the dehumidifiers are running. It'll stabilize. Hope isn't a strategy." She straightened, turning that critical, dark gaze on me. "Do you have a hygrothermograph record for the last 48 hours? "I have a digital monitor," I pointed to the wall. "And I have my skin. I can feel when the paper starts to swell." Luna's eyebrow arched, a microscopic movement that conveyed a novel's worth of skepticism. "Your skin. That's your protocol? Intuition?" "Experience," I corrected. "I've kept this book alive for 6 months on a budget of 0. I know how it breathes." "Books don't breathe, they decay," she countered coldly. "And my job is to arrest that decay, not empathize with it." She turned back to the table, and the friction between us wasn't just professional anymore. It was physical. The air felt too thin, used up by the intensity of her presence. She leaned over the map of Cassiopeia, her focus absolute. I stepped in next to her, needing to defend my charge, the space suddenly shrinking around us. Luna reached across me to check a watermark in the upper corner of the page. She didn't say, "Excuse me." She just moved, assuming the space was hers to take. Her arm brushed against mine, the fabric of her tailored blazer rough against my bare skin. But the heat radiating off her was startling. It wasn't the cold, sterile heat of a machine. It was human, alive, and confusingly magnetic. For a second, I forgot about the water damage. I was paralyzed by the proximity. I could smell her again, that complex, layered scent of rain and something sharper, like expensive ink. It was intoxicating and infuriating all at once. She was right there, in my personal space, dismantling my confidence with nothing but a magnifying glass and perfect posture. "Look here," she murmured. The command was soft, directed at the page, but my body reacted like she'd touched me. I leaned in, our heads inches apart. "What?" "The chain lines," she said, her voice dropping to a hush that felt intimate despite the context. "They're stressed. Someone tried to flatten this page with too much moisture. Was that you?" I pulled back, the accusation stinging like a slap. "No, that's historical damage from the 1920s rebinding." "Are you sure?" She turned her head, and suddenly we were face to face. I could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the faint line of tension at the corner of her mouth. She was cataloging my reactions, looking for the lie, looking for the incompetence. And I felt it crumble, my defense, my pride. In her eyes, I wasn't the talented conservator holding it all together. I was the frazzled single mother who couldn't fix a leak, who couldn't afford the right equipment, who was one bad appraisal away from losing the roof over her daughter's head. She saw the cracks in the plaster and the cracks in me. "I'm sure," I whispered, holding her gaze because looking away would be an admission of guilt. I know what I'm doing, Luna, even if I don't have your budget. The moment stretched, heavy and taut. She held my eyes for a beat longer than necessary, the air between us vibrating with a strange, antagonistic current. Then she blinked, breaking the contact. Good, she said, turning back to the book. Because we have to strip the old spine lining. Tonight. Tonight? I echoed. Unless you want that mold to bloom by morning. She picked up a scalpel, the metal catching the light. We work until it's stable. Do you have a problem with that? I looked at her hands. Steady, capable, dangerous. I hated that she was right. I hated that I needed her. No, I said, grabbing my own tools. No problem at all. By 3 a.m., the studio had ceased to be a room and had become a capsule, floating somewhere outside of normal time. The rain had softened to a consistent, rhythmic drumming against the skylights, a heartbeat that matched the hum of the dehumidifier in the corner. We had retreated into the darkness, the only illumination coming from the twin halos of the task lamps clamped to the workbench. The rest of the world, the bank notices, the leaks, the loneliness, had receded into the shadows, leaving only the pool of light, the smell of ethanol and wet paper, and us. The hostility hadn't vanished, but it had transmuted into something denser, heavier. We were working in a rhythm now, a silent, necessary choreography. I would lift a page on the polyester web. She would slide the blotting paper underneath. It was precise work, demanding a level of focus that usually left me exhausted. But tonight, the adrenaline of her presence was keeping me wired. It's warm, Luna murmured. It wasn't a complaint, just a statement of fact. She stepped back from the table, and for the first time, the armor cracked. She unbuttoned her blazer. I kept my eyes on the book, feigning intense concentration on a water stain near the constellation of Orion. But my peripheral vision was a traitor. She shrugged the jacket off, draping it carefully over a stool. And then she went for the cuffs of her silk shirt. I watched, despite myself, as she rolled the sleeves up. It was such a mundane action, something I'd seen 1,000 people do. But on her, it felt like a revelation. Her forearms were unexpected, lean and defined, the muscles shifting under pale skin as she flexed her hands. They were capable hands, strong enough to dismantle a company, but gentle enough to handle paper that was dissolving into dust. A silver watch glinted on her left wrist, looking heavy and masculine against the delicate bones. "Focus, Vance," she said, catching me looking. But there was no bite in it this time. Her voice was lower, rougher around the edges from fatigue. "I am focused," I lied, my throat dry. "Page 42. It's the worst one. The mold damage is deep." We moved to the washing tray. This was the critical moment, submerging the brittle paper to rinse out the degradation products. It required 4 hands and absolute stillness. "On my count," Luna said, moving to my side. She was close. Too close. The barrier of professional distance had evaporated in the humidity of the room. I could feel the heat radiating from her arm, inches from mine. 1, 2, lift! We lifted the mesh support together, lowering the page into the water. It floated, fragile as a breath. "Steady," she whispered. I adjusted my grip, sweating, focused entirely on the surface tension. The water rippled slightly, but I held the line. "Good," Luna breathed, her voice right at my ear. "Hold it there." We were frozen in that circle of light, our bodies angled toward each other over the ruins of a star map, connected by nothing but the shared tension of the task. I turned my head slowly. Luna was looking at me. Her gaze wasn't critical anymore. It was dark, dilated, and unflinchingly intense. She was looking at my mouth, then up to my eyes, mapping the tension in my face with the same precision she'd used on the book. The air between us thickened, coiled tight with everything we weren't saying. It was a sultry, heavy pull, undeniable as gravity. "You have good hands," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But you need to breathe." I realized then that I had been holding my breath until my lungs burned. I exhaled, shaky and uneven. "I'm breathing," I managed to say, though it sounded like a confession. "Good." She held my gaze for a second longer, savoring the charge, letting the moment hang there, ripe and terrifying. Then, slowly, deliberately, she released my hand. "Let's finish this." The spell of the night didn't break. It shattered. The transition from the sacred, hermetic seal of our 3 a.m. vigil to the abrasive gray light of Tuesday afternoon was jarring, like waking up from a fever dream to find the bill collectors waiting on the porch. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world outside the studio windows dripping and exhausted, a mirror image of how I felt. Luna and I had barely spoken since dawn. We had moved around each other in a haze of caffeine and silent efficiency, the air between us still thick with the memory of her hand covering mine, of that moment where the professional veneer had thinned to transparency. But the atmosphere shifted the second the yellow school bus squealed to a halt outside. The hydraulic hiss of the doors opening was a siren, signaling the invasion of my real life into this fragile, constructed sanctuary. I froze, a sponge poised over a page of Gemini. "My daughter," I said, the words tasting like an apology before I'd even made one. "She gets off the bus here on Tuesdays." I looked at Luna, expecting the inevitable recoil. I expected the tightening of the jaw, the glance at the expensive watch, the subtle shift in posture that said, children don't belong in a sterile conservation lab. I was ready for her to tell me that this was unprofessional, that the environment was compromised, that she would return when I had my domestic chaos under control. I was already formulating the defense, the desperate explanation that I couldn't afford a sitter. Then the front door banged open. "Mom!" Sophie's voice was a bright, chaotic instrument that cut through the studious silence. She blew into the room like a gust of wind, smelling of damp wool and playground mulch, her backpack thumping against the doorframe. She stopped dead when she saw Luna. The studio went quiet. I stepped forward, instinctively putting myself between the archivist and the child, a shield raised against judgment. "Sophie, honey, slow down," I started, wiping my hands on my apron. "We have a guest. This is Ms. Sterling. You need to be quiet today, okay? We're working on something very old." I risked a glance at Luna. She had turned from the workbench, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. She wasn't looking at her watch. She was looking at Sophie. And she wasn't scowling. Her expression was unreadable, still terrifyingly calm, but the coldness was gone. She studied my 7-year-old daughter with the same serious, respectful intensity she had applied to the celestial atlas. "It's not just old," Luna said, her voice dropping to that low, resonant register that always made the hair on my arms stand up. She crouched down. She didn't bend at the waist like an adult patronizing a child. She sank into a crouch, bringing her eyes level with Sophie's. "It's a map of the sky from before your grandmother's grandmother was born." Sophie's eyes went wide. She looked from Luna to the book, then back to Luna. She wasn't used to adults who spoke to her with gravity. She was used to tired smiles and distracted nods. "Is it broken?" Sophie whispered, pointing a small finger at the discolored page we were treating. "It looks hurt." I flinched. Hurt. Broken. The words I used for myself in the dark. "It is hurt," Luna agreed, and she didn't look at me, but I felt the weight of her attention shifting in my periphery. "But that's why it's valuable. Perfect things are boring, Sophie. This book has survived floods and fires and people who didn't know how to hold it. See these marks? She gestured to the water stains we had been agonizing over for 6 hours. Sophie stepped closer, drawn in by Luna's magnetic focus. Those are scars, Luna said softly. They prove that it lived through the storm. We aren't trying to erase them. We're just making sure they don't hurt anymore, so the story can keep going. I stood paralyzed by the workbench. I watched this woman, this corporate executioner in her silk shirt and tailored trousers, explain the philosophy of conservation to my second grader with a patience that made my chest ache. It was a sharp, physical pain, a sudden suture pulling tight in the center of my ribcage. I had spent so long holding up the sky by myself, convincing myself that my isolation was a necessary fortress. I had told myself that no one else could fit in this cramped, dusty life of mine. But watching Luna's dark head bent close to Sophie's messy ponytail, seeing the way she treated my daughter's curiosity not as an interruption, but as a valid inquiry, the fortress shook. Luna looked up then. She caught me watching them. Her gaze was stripped of the professional armor, open and searching. She didn't smile. She wasn't a woman who gave away smiles for free. But the look she gave me was a caress. It was an acknowledgement of the struggle, a validation of the mess. She has your eyes, Luna said quietly, standing up and smoothing her trousers. She has my stubbornness. I managed to choke out, my voice unsteady. Good, Luna replied, turning back to the table, but leaving the warmth of her presence lingering in the space between us. She's going to need it. The dynamic in the room had fractured and reformed into something new. The rivalry was dissolving, replaced by a dangerous, terrifying curiosity. I wasn't just afraid of her taking the book anymore. I was beginning to be afraid of what would happen when she finally left. Sophie was asleep upstairs, leaving the studio to us and the solvents. The air had changed again. It was sharper now, acrid with ethanol and the faint, sweet decay of the iron gall ink. The stakes had shifted from physical repair to chemical warfare. We had to treat the corrosion on the Andromeda plate, a delicate lattice of acid burns that threatened to eat through the paper if we looked at it wrong. It requires a two-step application, Luna said. She was studying the chemical mixture, swirling the beaker with a mesmerizing, steady rhythm. Simultaneous. One to neutralize, one to buffer. If we mistime it, the ink bleeds. I know the protocol, I said, though my voice felt thin in the expansive silence of the room. But I can't reach the upper meridian while holding the suction table steady. My arms aren't long enough. Luna didn't hesitate. She didn't suggest a stool or a workaround. She simply moved. Then I'll be your shadow, she murmured. She stepped behind me. It was a practical decision, a matter of geometry, but the effect was devastating. The space between my back and her front was measured in millimeters, a charged gap that crackled with static. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a solid wall of warmth against my spine. She reached around me, her arms bracketing my body to access the upper edge of the map. We were locked together, a single complex machine built for this one delicate task. Ready? Her voice was right at my ear, a low vibration that traveled down my neck and settled heavy in my chest. I could smell the sandalwood again, warmer now, mixed with the sharp bite of the chemicals. Ready, I whispered. We began. It was a dance of millimeters. I applied suction, she applied solution. Her hands moved in my peripheral vision, steady and confident. Every time she leaned in to reach a difficult spot, her body brushed against mine, a hip against my lower back, a forearm grazing my shoulder. It wasn't accidental. It was the unavoidable friction of the job, but it felt like arson. My focus began to fray. I was trying to watch the ink, trying to monitor the absorption rate, but my body was hyper-aware of the woman standing in my blind spot. I could hear her breathing, slow and controlled. I could feel the rise and fall of her chest when she leaned closer. The intimacy was suffocating, a dense pressure that made my hands feel heavy. We reached the critical point, the dense cluster of stars near the constellation's heart. The paper there was lace thin. "Careful," Luna breathed, her lips so close to my ear that I felt the ghost of the word against my skin. "Don't flood it." That's when it happened. My hand, usually rock steady after years of this work, betrayed me. A tremor, small but violent, ran through my wrist. The brush tip wavered, threatening to drop a heavy bead of solvent onto the unprotected ink. Panic flared, hot and white. But before the drop could fall, Luna was there. She didn't shout. She didn't shove me aside. Her hand clamped over my right wrist, freezing the motion instantly. Her grip was firm, authoritative, and terrifyingly grounding. It wasn't just a correction. It was a claim. Her fingers wrapped around my pulse point, pressing into the racing vein there, anchoring me to the table, to the moment, to her. "I've got you," she said. The words were low, stripped of any judgment. She didn't let go. She guided my hand, using her own strength to steady the brush. We finished the stroke together, her hand over mine, her body pressed flush against my back now to leverage the angle. The contact was absolute. I could feel the line of her buttons against my spine, the solid weight of her presence holding me up when my knees felt like water. It was sultry, this forced compliance. It was a surrender I hadn't known I was craving. The solvent evaporated, the ink held, and the danger to the book passed. But as we stood there, frozen in that embrace of necessity, I realized the danger had simply migrated. Luna's thumb swept across the inside of my wrist, a slow, deliberate stroke over my pulse. It was the most erotic thing that had ever happened to me. And we were standing in a basement smelling of chemicals. "Steady," she whispered again. And I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or to the racing heart she could undoubtedly feel under her fingertips. She stepped back slowly, peeling her heat away from my back, leaving me shivering in the sudden cold of the room. The chemical reaction was complete. The bond was set. And I knew, with a sinking, terrifying certainty, that I wasn't going to survive this woman unscathed. The book was safe. I was ruined. The silence returned, louder and heavier than before. The adrenaline left us all at once, draining out like water from a cracked vessel and leaving behind a heavy, vibrating exhaustion. We retreated from the high-stakes theater of the workbench to the shadows of the back corner, collapsing onto the velvet sofa that had been in the studio since before I signed the lease. It was a piece of furniture that had surrendered its structural integrity years ago, sagging in the middle in a way that forced gravity to conspire against us, pulling our bodies into a proximity that felt dangerous and inevitable. I sat with my head tipped back against the worn fabric, eyes closed, listening to the cadence of Luna breathing next to me. The silence wasn't sharp anymore. It didn't have teeth. It was the companionable, intimate silence of soldiers who had just survived a skirmish, or lovers who were afraid to speak and break the spell. The air smelled of stale coffee and the lingering, metallic tang of our anxiety, but underneath it all was that persistent scent of hers, sandalwood and expensive decisions. "You said something to Sophie." Luna's voice broke the quiet, low and thoughtful. "About scars." I opened my eyes. She was watching me, her profile softened by the dim light of the task lamps across the room. She had rolled her sleeves up further, and I found myself staring at the delicate blue vein on the inside of her wrist, the same pulse point she had pressed against mine only an hour ago. "I tell her that so she doesn't worry about me," I confessed, the truth slipping out before I could polish it. She saw her father leave. She saw me fall apart. I need her to believe that things can be put back together, even if they look different afterwards. I looked at my hands, stained with ink, scarred by paper cuts. He left because I was too much work, because I cared too much about the details and not enough about the big picture. I suppose he was right. I'm still here, obsessing over microscopic tears in paper while the roof leaks. He was an idiot, Luna said. The venom in her voice was quiet, controlled, and startlingly protective. She shifted, turning her body fully toward me. Her knee brushed mine, a deliberate breach of the neutral zone, sending a fresh wave of heat up my thigh. I spend my life assessing value, Kristen. I walk into rooms full of history, and I decide what gets saved and what gets discarded. I am the executioner. Do you know what that does to a person? She looked down at her hands, the hands that held so much power. It makes you cold. It makes you terrified of imperfection, because imperfection is a liability. I've spent 10 years polishing myself into something hard and untouchable, because I thought that was strength. It is strength, I whispered. No, she corrected, her gaze snapping back to mine, dark and unflinching. It's armor. It's hollow. She reached out then. It wasn't a tentative gesture. Her hand moved through the space between us and settled on the cushion right next to my hip, her fingers curling into the fabric. She was close enough that I could count the eyelashes framing those intelligent, terrifying eyes. What you have, she murmured, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest, is real. You bleed, you panic, you fight. You stand in a leaking room and defend a book like it's your own child. That isn't a mess, Kristen. It's vitality. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with a sudden, sultry pressure that made it hard to expand my lungs. The distance between us felt non-existent, burned away by the intensity of her focus. I came here expecting to find a liability, Luna continued, and her eyes dropped to my mouth, lingering there with a hunger that made my stomach flip. Instead, I found the most compelling thing I've seen in a decade. Your resilience. The way you hold your ground, even when you're terrified. It's not just professional. It's a turn-on. It makes me want to stop assessing and start. She trailed off, leaving the word hanging in the heavy air. A promise and a threat all at once. The tension coiled tight between us, a physical thing that pulled at my center. I wanted her to finish the sentence. I wanted her to bridge the last few inches and prove that she wasn't just observing the fire, but was willing to burn in it. Start what? I breathed, the question reckless. Luna leaned in, her breath ghosting against my cheek, warm and close. Start breaking my own rules. The sky finally tore open, unleashing a deluge that felt personal. It wasn't just rain anymore. It was a violent, hammering assault that rattled the skylights and turned the world outside into a blurred, hostile gray. The studio felt smaller, the air pressure dropping until my ears popped. We were sealed in, cut off from the timeline of the rest of the city, trapped in a pressure cooker of humidity and unvoiced desire. We had moved back to the workbench for the final stage, re-sewing the binding structure. It was the most delicate part of the resurrection, a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence that I usually performed in solitude, treating the spine like a complex surgical suture. But tonight, the solitude was gone, replaced by a presence that felt heavier than the storm. I sat at the sewing frame, the linen cords taut in front of me, the curved needle flashing in the harsh circle of the lamplight. In, around, out. In, around, out. The waxed thread hissed softly as it passed through the paper, a sound like a held breath being released. Luna sat on the high stool opposite me, her elbows on the table, her chin resting on her laced fingers. She wasn't checking the humidity monitor anymore. She wasn't looking at the clock or her phone. She was watching me. Her gaze was physical, a tactile weight that traced the movement of my hands. I could feel it on my skin, warm and unflinching. Most clients watched the artifact, terrified for their investment. Luna watched the labor. She watched the way the muscles in my forearm shifted as I pulled the tension tight. She watched the way I bit my lip when the needle hit a patch of resistance in the fold. She was witnessing the act of reconstruction with a hunger that made my hands shake, just slightly. It was unnerving. It was exhilarating. "You have a rhythm," she murmured, her voice weaving through the sound of the rain. "Like a heartbeat." "It's the only way to keep the tension even," I replied, not looking up. If I looked up, if I met those dark, intelligent eyes now, I would lose the count. I would lose everything. If you hesitate, the binding is loose. If you pull too hard, the paper tears. "And you never tear the paper," she stated. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of competence that felt like a caress. I try not to. The silence stretched again, filled only by the storm and the soft tuck of the needle. In that quiet, the truth hit me harder than the thunder rattling the glass. I didn't want this to end. I didn't want the book to be finished. A finished book meant a closed case. It meant the assessment was over. It meant Luna would pack that expensive leather briefcase, button her blazer, and walk back into her world of high-stakes appraisals and sterile archives, leaving me here, in my safe, lonely sanctuary, to listen to the drip of the pipes and the echo of my own breathing. For the first time in 3 years, safety felt suffocating. I didn't want the quiet anymore. I wanted the friction. I wanted the woman who looked at my scars and called them vitality. I wanted the storm she brought with her. "You're slowing down," Luna noted softly. "I'm being careful," I lied. I was stalling. I was hoarding these last few minutes of proximity, dragging out the final stitches like a lifeline. "No," she corrected, leaning forward until her face was bathed in the light, her eyes locking onto mine over the top of the sewing frame. "You're hesitating. You don't want to tie the knot." She saw everything. It was terrifying. "If I tie it, the job is done," I said, my voice barely audible. "The book is done," she amended, her gaze dropping to my mouth. "That's not the same thing." Her words hung there, suspended in the electric air. I looked down at the final gathering, the last signature, the end of the road. I took a breath, stealing the scent of her one last time, that sandalwood and rain mixture that had become the atmosphere of my entire world, and pushed the needle through. I looped the thread, pulled it tight. The kettle stitch locked into place. Snip. The sound of the scissors cutting the thread was final, like a door clicking shut. The book was whole. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. The silence that followed the snip of the scissors was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums. The job was done. The Andromeda plate was secure, the spine was reinforced, and the 17th century celestial atlas was no longer a dying thing. It was whole. It was safe. And because it was safe, the reason for Luna Sterling to be standing in my studio, breathing my air, was gone. She stood up slowly, her movements lacking their usual fluid precision. She looked at the book one last time, running a finger along the edge of the text block, not checking for errors this time, but saying goodbye. Then, she turned to her tools. The sound of her packing was excruciating. The slide of the Teflon bone folder into its leather loop, the click of the scalpel cap, the rustle of the micro spatulas being gathered. Each sound was a syllable in a sentence I didn't want to hear. She was dismantling the temporary ecosystem we had built. She was putting the armor back on. "The adhesive needs 24 hours to cure fully," Luna said, her voice reverting to that cool professional cadence. She didn't look at me. She focused entirely on the geometry of her briefcase. "I'll draft the final condition report in the morning. You can submit your invoice then." Invoice. The word hung in the humid air like an insult. It reduced the last 2 days, the shared breath, the hand-over-hand rescues, the confession on the velvet couch, to a transaction. A line item. She snapped the locks of the briefcase shut. Click. Click. "That's it?" I asked. My voice sounded rough, scraped raw by exhaustion and desire. Luna froze, her hands still resting on the handle of the case. She didn't turn around. "The asset is stabilized, Kristen. My job is done." "Is it?" I didn't think. I didn't calculate the risk or the professional ramifications. I just moved. I walked around the end of the workbench, ignoring the fatigue that made my legs feel like lead. I stepped into her space, that charged magnetic field that she carried with her, like a shield. "Luna," I said. And the name felt different now that I wasn't using it to argue about humidity level. She turned then. Her eyes were dark, guarded, but the mask was slipping. I saw the hesitation in the set of her jaw. I saw the way her gaze dropped to my mouth and stayed there. "You're not just an executioner," I whispered, repeating her own words back to her. "And I'm not just a vendor." "Kristen," she warned, a low rumble that sounded less like a stop sign and more like a plea. "If I stay—" "If you leave," I interrupted, closing the last few inches between us. "The book survives, but I think we both lose." The air thickened. The smell of rain and sandalwood was overwhelming. She looked at me, really looked at me, with that terrifying, intelligent intensity, searching for a reason to run. She didn't find one. "I hate losing," she murmured. Then she moved. Her hand came up, cupping my jaw, her thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with a reverence she usually reserved for vellum. The touch was electric, grounding and shattering all at once. She kissed me. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't a question. It was a collision. Her mouth found mine with a desperate, starving weight that buckled my knees. I grabbed the lapels of her silk shirt, pulling her closer, needing to feel the solid reality of her against me. It was a sultry confirmation of every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of tension that had built up over the last 48 hours. It tasted like coffee and exhaustion and relief. She made a low sound in her throat, a vibration I felt against my own lips, and deepened the kiss. Her other hand slid around my waist, pulling me flush against her, pressing me into the edge of the workbench. The hard wood cut into my hip, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was the heat of her, the demand of her mouth, the way she was unraveling me and putting me back together in a completely new configuration. We broke apart only when air became a necessity, resting our foreheads together, breathing in the same ragged rhythm. My hands were still clutching her shirt. Her hands were still holding me up. "Okay," she whispered against my skin, her voice wrecked. "Okay." We stayed like that as the storm outside finally exhausted itself, fading into a gentle, weeping drizzle. We stayed like that until the gray light of dawn began to bleed through the skylights, turning the shadows into morning. The night was over. But as the sun crept across the floorboards, illuminating the finished book, I knew the real story was just beginning. The morning sun hit the workbench with the subtlety of an interrogation lamp. It exposed everything. The dust motes dancing in the stale air, the empty coffee cups, and the dark circles under my eyes. It also illuminated the stack of documents Luna was organizing on the counter. She was back in her blazer, the silk shirt buttoned to the throat, the armor reassembled. She looked every inch the terrifying archivist who had walked in 48 hours ago to audit my life. My stomach twisted into a cold knot. The kiss, the desperate collision against the workbench, the shared breath in the dark. In the harsh light of day, it felt like a hallucination, a fever dream brought on by exhaustion and solvent fumes. Was this the part where she handed me a check, shook my hand with professional detachment, and disappeared back to the city to forget the conservator who almost ruined a 17th century masterpiece? "Coffee," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. I slid a mug across the table. It was a peace offering. A question. "Thank you." She took it, her fingers brushing mine, a spark, faint, but there. But she didn't drink. Instead, she slid a thick, cream-colored file folder toward me. The appraisal. I froze. This was it, the verdict. I opened the folder, my hands shaking just enough to be embarrassing. I scanned the columns, my eyes darting past the technical jargon, looking for the red ink. I was looking for the deduction for water damage, for environmental instability, for unauthorized emergency repairs. I was waiting to see the number that would bankrupt me. Instead, I saw a figure at the bottom of the page that made my breath hitch in my throat. It was higher than the original estimate, significantly higher. "I don't understand," I looked up at her, bewildered. "The water damage, the risk, the stain on the Andromeda plate. The damage is part of its provenance now," Luna said, her voice steady, cool, and utterly professional. "And the restoration is exceptional. I've noted in the official report that the conservation work adds a unique narrative layer to the artifact's history. It's not just a stagnant book anymore, Kristen. It's a survivor. That increases the market value." She was looking at me, not the papers. The professional mask was there, rigid and perfect, but behind the dark eyes, the warmth from last night was simmering, waiting. "So, you're approving the loan extension?" "I'm recommending a full preservation grant for the studio," she corrected, tapping the paper. "You shouldn't be working with a leaking roof. It's a liability to your talent." I leaned against the counter, the relief washing over me so intensely that my knees felt like water. "Thank you. I don't know what to say. You saved me." "I didn't save you," she said softly. "I just recognized the value." She took a slow sip of coffee. "Say you'll have dinner with me." I blinked, the whiplash nearly knocking me over. "Dinner? You're leaving. Your flight is at noon. You have a board meeting tomorrow." Luna set the mug down. I canceled it. It turns out there are several local archives in this area that require extensive study. I requested a 6-month sabbatical to conduct field research. "Field research," I repeated, a smile finally breaking through the anxiety. "Very intensive field research," she agreed, her gaze dropping to my lips. "I suspect it will take up most of my nights." The shop door chime didn't ring, but the heavy oak door to the apartment upstairs creaked open. Sophie stood there in her flannel pajamas, hair a bird's nest, clutching her stuffed rabbit by the ears. She looked at me, then at the terrifying archivist, then at the finished book resting on its velvet pillow. "Is it fixed?" she asked, her voice raspy with sleep. Luna turned. She didn't check her watch. She didn't look annoyed at the intrusion. She smiled, a real, soft thing that transformed her sharp features into something beautiful. "Yes, Sophie, it's fixed. It just needed some help holding itself together." "Are you staying for breakfast?" Sophie asked, stepping into the room. "Mom makes pancakes when she's happy." "She looks happy." I looked at Luna, the executioner, the savior, the woman who had seen my mess and called it a turn-on. "I think," Luna said, looking back at me with a promise written in the set of her jaw, "I'm staying for a lot more than breakfast." I used to think that broken things were liabilities. I thought scars devalued the whole, and that I had to hide the cracks in my life to survive. But sometimes, it takes someone tracing those cracks with a gentle, unflinching finger to show you that they aren't wounds. They're the binding that holds the story together. The door to my studio doesn't just open for customers anymore. It opens for a partner. If you believe that love can be found in the repair, check out the next video. Subscribe to follow the rest of our journey.